talk about a very specific application of artificial intelligence. We were asked in one of the earlier panels, which was great, Amy's talk was great, about business applications. And so I'm going to be very specific. This is really about employment selection, about hiring. There's all different types of employment selection, but I'm going to be specific about hiring and talent acquisition. And as I was already introduced, I like to give a little bit of background about who I am when I'm talking to different groups, because I often get put up in front of groups where I am not of the group that I'm speaking to. So what I mean by that is I often get put up in front of like attorneys. So I start by saying, I am not a lawyer. And here I feel I should say I'm neither a computer scientist nor really like a business expert type person. What I am is a scientist, a psychologist. My background's in experimental psychology. I'm very much into the scientific method, and by that I mean starting with a theory, coming up with a testable, falsifiable hypothesis, looking at the data, and having that inform your theory. So that's where I come from, and I think that's important as I'm talking to you to just qualify the things I'm saying. As was already mentioned, I came from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the federal agency that regulates and enforces civil rights laws when it comes to employment selection, hiring, promotion, pay, termination, all that kind of thing. And so very recently, just in about the last month, I left the federal government and moved into private industry, and I'm now working for Pymetrics. I'll talk more about how that fits in with my topic today, but the reason why, honestly, I felt comfortable leaving the agency that regulates these types of vendors and enforces civil rights laws and going to Pymetrics is because not only do they focus their algorithms on accuracy or optimize for accuracy, but also for fairness. And by fairness, I mean fairness to everybody who might want to come and work for a particular company. So these are the changes. This is really the revolution, for lack of a better term, that's going on right now in employment selection. It used to be, you submit your resume, somebody reviews it, maybe you take a personality assessment, an IQ test, these types of things. Those are all traditional over on that side. Another thing that's really traditional is job analysis and validity documentation. So does anybody know what I mean when I say job analysis? It's not usually a very common term that people are aware of. It's old school industrial organizational psychology where you actually go to an employer and you talk to people who do a job and you ask, what does it take to do the job? What do you do in this position? Talk to job experts. And then with that, you think about, okay, what types of selection devices should we use to hire additional people in the future? So if it's a job in, something like a parking lot attendant, just like somebody who's there to take the money, give you your ticket, this kind of thing. Job analysis would take a look at that, what's required to be that type of person, to do that type of job. And the important part of that is then looking back at what types of selection procedures will you use to hire into that role, and are they really related to the job? So if somebody's something like a parking lot attendant, do you think they need to take like an IQ test and pass an IQ test to get the job? You think that, who said that? Oh, nobody wants to claim it? One of the reasons why I would argue they shouldn't is because you're going to screen out a bunch of people who could do the job. And do you know what happens when you give people IQ tests? Do you know who tends to be screened out? This has been the case for a really long time. There's landmark civil rights Supreme Court case law on this stuff. And it used to be worse than it is now, but there still are racial and gender differences in IQ scoring, right? So anyway, that's when I talk about validity and job analysis, that's the traditional way of doing these things. The newer way of doing these things, and this revolution that we're going through right now, is really taking machine learning algorithms and rethinking ways to set up screening devices. So really what I think it helps sort of think it through is more of like a matchmaking approach to job selection, job search. So when I say that, I mean looking at the people who perform well in a position and asking yourself, what do they have in common with each other? What is the person like who's good at the job, right? So that's the training data that you feed into the machine learning algorithm to come up with what should we be screening on? How can we match who would be really good at this job with who wants the job? So that's a really big difference, because it used to be one of the landmark Supreme Court case in this area is Griggs Duke Power. And so Duke Power, which is an energy company in North Carolina, basically said, this was after Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, said, okay, we can't segregate people anymore legally, so now we're going to require an IQ test, a minimum score on an IQ test, and a high school diploma before we let people move up into higher level jobs. And so that looks fair, an IQ test and a high school diploma, but it had, as we talked about a minute ago, the effect of screening out African Americans and keeping them in lower level jobs. So my point in bringing that up is that it used to be you either pass or fail the test. You either get the job or you don't by pass-fail. When we talk about machine learning algorithms, we're talking about matching people up in terms of their similarity to other folks in the position, especially folks that are doing a good job. These are quite different things. Maybe if you haven't thought about this before, it might take a minute to think about the big leap. But the question that came up earlier, like how do you get people, someone asked Amy, how do you get people to adopt these new approaches? And Amy said, well, you know, we're kind of past that. Everybody gets that it's a good thing. In this space, it's just happening now. This is a really exciting time right now because there's a lot of resistance, a lot. When I say that I am the head of IO science for this place, people hear industrial organizational psychologist and they think, oh, you're going to be resistant because that's the old guard. And the new guard is computer science and machine learning. Luckily for me, I'm actually a different kind of psychologist, an experimental. So I think that kind of keeps me out of the fray a little bit. So we have things like passive data collection. Obviously, everything you're doing in life, there's data you're generating, and different vendors who are creating algorithms can take that type of information out there and figure out how is that similar to top performers in jobs. That's sort of a big step back picture of it. There's also gamification, which I have up here, and that's what my company Pymetrics does. So we actually do use the more traditional personality IQ type measures, but instead of pass-fail, it is similarity to top performers in a position. And I think that's pretty cool because I get a lot of people asking me, like, do you know what I mean when I say like dust bowl empiricism? Like you're not really, like this thing isn't really a science, you guys are just like doing numbers. Pymetrics is definitely not that because it's all based in very traditional, going back decades, science that's published in respectable journals and whatnot. But the approach is a little bit different. So the promise of these approaches, which I'm sure you can think about and relate to, is that, first of all, they're probably more effective. Old school industrial organizational psychologists were really happy if they could predict like 30% of the variance in an outcome measure, meaning the outcome measure might be job performance. If we can come up with 30% of the variance in that outcome measure, then we're doing great. The place I work for now, I was just reviewing some documentation for them, and it's like 75, 80%. And that's after debiasing. That's after looking at, okay, if we use this algorithm, are we going to screen out African Americans, women, and so on and so forth? And again, optimizing the algorithm to make it as predictive as possible and as least biased or as fair as possible. So even after that, you've got this huge increase in effectiveness that you're going to predict who's going to be the best at this job. Also, there's all kinds of measures of return on investment that come out of this type work that didn't used to be there for HR and IO science. Reducing cost to hire, reducing costs associated with turnover, right? When you hire somebody, it's expensive. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but you have to train them up. You have to give a little bit of time so they can get on board. And then when they leave, it's expensive because you have to replace them and you have to go through all that again. So if you can hire people who are going to stay and do a good job and like it is another thing, cost can significantly decrease. Fairness. So when I first started studying this, again, this goes back to where I came from Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. When I first started seeing these things come across my desk, I was thinking, oh God, this isn't going to be fair. This isn't going to be okay. These algorithms are going to screen out all kinds of people. It's not going to be fair. It's a big problem. I was really scared about it. But the more I learn about and the more I talk to actual computer scientists and the ones that I'm working with and the ones that I'm not working with, there's more discussion about just tell us the problem you want to fix, tell us what you want to optimize on, and we'll do it. And so that's what's really cool about Pymetrics and a handful of other vendors in this space is they're like, okay, Let's do it. Let's collect the race information. Let's collect the gender information, and then let's look at the activity of our algorithms and see what's going on. Very cool. So there's a lot of power to fix long-standing problems. One long-standing problem with regard to, I've mentioned IQ tests a couple times. IQ tests are probably the most predictive measure of job performance. This is a pretty well-published finding across all jobs. Because you know IQ, the secret about IQ is nobody actually knows what it is, but we think it's how quickly you can learn, right? So if you think about what makes somebody good at a job, you get thrown in there and you have to learn stuff. The problem with IQ is that it's related to race and gender, like I said. So there's something called the adverse impact validity trade-off, which is also well published. So it's like the better predictive your IQ test, the more likely you are to screen out protected groups. This is a problem that goes back, I remember learning about this in grad school many years ago, and thinking, geez, whoever comes up with the answer to that problem will be loaded. And the cool thing about machine learning is that we can totally get there. We can figure out what's the best way, because really at the heart of it, I'm sure you'll agree with me, that there's no difference between men and women in terms of like how quickly we can learn. There's no difference between the different races in terms of how quickly we can learn. It's all a problem with the measurement instrument. There's some sociocultural stuff that's wrapped up in it, but over time, those differences change as society becomes more equal and fair and people get to go to school and all this kind of thing. So it's a matter of what's the construct, what is it really that you're trying to measure, how is it related to the job, and what's the best way to measure it? Caution. So as I said, when I was at EEOC, this stuff really scared me, and that's how I got into it, was like, this is scary, I don't understand it, I need to know more about it. Because not that many charges, which is what EEOC runs on, like someone is treated poorly when they're applying or when they're working, and so they take a charge of discrimination to EEOC. Not many charges have come in based on these algorithms yet because they're just not that like widely used yet. But I knew that they'd be coming, and it scared me. It scared me for the reason that industrial organizational psychologists are trained in things like employment law. That's why I know a little bit about it. And they're trained to think about things like, okay, if you bring something like address into an algorithm for employment selection, an IO psychologist would know that could be troublesome. Can anybody guess why an address in a machine learning algorithm for employment selection could be troublesome? It's all tied up with your socioeconomic background, where you live, especially in places like the South that were historically segregated. So it's true that distance from the office is predictive of performance, but it's also tied up with race. So you should be really careful about using variables like that. Computer scientists not really trained in that type of stuff very commonly. And they're the ones who are writing the algorithms. This thing about job relatedness, I noticed a big change in terms of not really doing those job analyses I was talking about, not really going and talking to people about what does the job take and all this kind of stuff. With a machine learning algorithm, it's just like, give me the people that do good at the job, let me give them some measures, let me figure out who they are, and then I'll find more people like that. And that scared me because I thought, if you're not thinking about fairness, you're going to run into trouble. So the future. I really honestly believe that this, and I hope it doesn't sound like lame, because I'm not a salesperson at all. Even if I wanted to sell you, I couldn't pitch you. I'm a scientist. But I really believe I wouldn't have left EEOC and jumped into it if I didn't believe this is the future of employment selection, talent acquisition. There are detractors. There are people who say, no way, it won't go on like this. We're all going to go back to the old traditional way. But the genie's out of the bottle. There's no putting it back. So we need to work to make it better, more fair, fix the blind spots. And you've already heard about, this is part of a bigger change out there, part of a bigger revolution. Things like politics, marketing, healthcare. I'm sure you've heard about who the head of President Trump's re-election campaign will be, Brad Parscale. He was the head of digital. I'm from DC, so I'm all like in it. And so the thing about, figuring out who's the audience, and in this case, the audience might be voters, who's the audience and how do we sell to them, is going on in politics as much as it's going on in marketing and in other places like that. And I think that President Trump's selection there mirrors that, absolutely. I also just want to say here at the end that AI is not only the problem, it's also the solution. Again, I hope it doesn't sound lame. I really believe it. Because things like, they're coming for our jobs, the robots are going to take our jobs away. I hate to say it, but it's kind of already happening, and it's going to continue to happen, especially with low-skill, repetitive jobs. I mean, a lot of that stuff is going to go away. So when I say AI is not only the problem, it's the solution also, tools like Pymetrics can help identify new career possibilities for people who might have never known about what all the different options are for them. And I can speak to this with total authority. I'm from the Rust Belt, and a lot of the jobs where I grew up are gone. There's factory stuff, manufacturing, that's where I grew up. So what happens to these people, And I think you see this playing out in like a larger sociocultural setting right now. What happens to these people? How do they feel? Not good. It's not really good for any of us when such large parts of our society are feeling that way, feeling displaced. Tools like this can help, look at folks like that and say, okay, what are you good at? What would you like? So that they can be pipelined into the right training opportunities for the new economy, if that makes sense. So with that, I think I'm out of time.
Thanks so much, Kelly. So I think we have time for 2 questions. Go right in the middle.
My question is that so there's obviously an element of human interaction when you hire someone. And do you think that your company and other peers will ultimately displace that as well? Like there'll be a time when the hiring manager doesn't even need to interact with someone and then the person gets hired? Because that doesn't sound like a good scenario to me.
Yeah, I hear you. So right now what's happening is it's earlier. So like Pymetrics, for example, sits at the top of what they call the top of funnel. So you've got all these people applying for a position, and you have to find a way to winnow that down to the bottom of the funnel. So tools can be very helpful, especially in places where people really want to go and work, and so you have so many folks. So it still is the case that once you get down to the bottom of the funnel, somebody's talking, somebody's laying eyes on. If you're asking my personal opinion, I don't think that'll ever go away, because we've all worked in different kinds of places, and we know you want to see it. You want to talk, right, to the people. Maybe not see them, but maybe at least talk to them and just get a sense for them. The point, and the thing that I know you weren't asking about diversity, but I'm really excited about the diversity aspect, because when you get to that place where a person comes in, it'd be really cool if that was a more diverse group. And so that's really where we're at right now. Down the road, I just can't see it that like people will be completely gone from it. Just like I feel that way more broadly as well. The idea about the machines taking our jobs, like maybe for top of funnel, maybe for repetitive low skill, but there's always going to be thoughtful people programming the machines and looking at their outputs. That's my feeling.
So having used your software and being a big proponent of Pymetrics, what do you find is the biggest resistance right now in getting a broader adoption?
The biggest resistance, which it's so interesting to me, especially, there's 2 things. Coming from EEOC, this is what's really interesting to me, is like, I'll see like an employment lawyer on the other side, like in-house counsel, saying, well, EEOC is not going to be okay with this. And I'm responding to emails where I'm trying to explain, take it down a notch and just think about it. It's not, don't have that knee-jerk reaction that it's not okay, and the regulators, whether it's EEOC or whatever, in different organizations, the regulators are going to be that closed-minded to it. I was there for 8 years, and federal agencies are full of people, normal people like us, who are just trying to figure stuff out and apply the right regulations. So that's one big thing. The other big thing is just that this is a massive machine that's been going for years and years and years. And there are very common producers in this area of things like IQ tests and personality tests. And they are not happy about this disruption, because things have been done a certain way for a really long time. And change is hard. And this is really a place where, honestly, it's happening like now. So that same resistance you've seen in other areas, I think you're seeing a lot in human capital.
Thanks so much, Kelly.
Could you talk about how you would get access to employees at all sorts of companies in all different areas? Are companies allowing you access to people, or are you just hoping that individuals will choose to use your
Yeah. I understand.
product.
Yeah. So with the place that I work, with Pymetrics, it really is like a company who wants to do hiring. Unilever is one of our well-known clients. Comes to us and says, like, we need a better way to do this because we know that some of the folks we're hiring aren't a good fit. They're not happy once they get here. So we want to try something different. And so in that context, again, Pymetrics is a little special because we're using tried and true measures. We've developed them to be fun. They're gamified, so like an applicant can play on their phone or their tablet or whatever, and it's more like a game than it is like a paper and pencil test. So I probably should have mentioned that. See, that's me not being a salesperson. It's kind of an important point. So we sit in a space where an employer comes to us and says, help us do better. But there are vendors out there, and there's really interesting legal battles that go on about like who owns the data. Like any data that's out there can be scraped and coded and organized. So things like, I mean, there's a fight between a vendor. This is me not being a lawyer either. I think it's over, but there's a vendor called HiQ in this space, and they do a lot of like recruiting and also flight risk. I didn't talk about that, but when you're at a company, many of the larger companies have numeric indicators of how likely you are to leave. That's called a flight risk indicator. And so HiQ does both things, like sourcing, recruiting, and flight risk calculations. And they do go, as far as I can tell, I don't have any insider knowledge, but from the legal proceedings I've seen, they go out and just scrape the net. And so one legal battle that they got into was with LinkedIn. So even if your LinkedIn is private, it's not that hard to like enter the address properly so that you can just see the data, maybe not the picture, but you can see like what's your previous experience and your skills. So HiQ was scraping LinkedIn, and LinkedIn said, that's our data, you're not allowed to do that. And they started fighting with each other pretty hardcore. So that's just an example of a vendor that goes out and collects information. And things like your voting record, not who you vote for, but the party, like the primary that you go to, and how many times you voted, that's public. I bought a house a few years ago, totally public, you can go look it up. Any federal employee, their salary, things like that, there's so much data out there that if you go out looking for it and have the tools and the wherewithal to bring it down and have some plan, then you can just use that data that's out there to make selections. Now, you need to train it on something. Amy made the good point earlier that an algorithm is nothing without the training data. So the training data in this case is some measure of success. So it's not like you can just sit at your computer, I can't see how you would do it, and just write an algorithm for selection for a particular company. But if you have training examples, success, then you can pull stuff and link things together in interesting ways. I'm sure I've gone over now.